Barnabas, Saul, and John Mark now prepared for the first organized overseas mission effort in Christian history. They probably loaded their goods onto a shallow draft shuttle boat here in the Orontes River and sailed down to its mouth at the port of Selucia on the Mediterranean Sea. These wall foundations and adjacent stone structures are all that remain of ancient Selucia, the bustling port city that once controlled all the shipping in and out of Antioch. Today, the place is called Cevlik in modern Turkey. Barnabas, Saul, and Mark would have transferred their baggage here from the Orontes River boat onto a larger Mediterranean vessel. Where were they headed? Like charity, mission work begins at home, and probably due to Barnabas's urging, they sailed first to the island of Cyprus, which lay 90 miles to the southwest. Sailing season in the Mediterranean began about March 10th each year after the storms of winter had passed. Very likely it was shortly after this date in early spring that they embarked. Had they waited until later, strong westerlies would have blown against them and the voyage to Cyprus would not have been so direct. Landing at the eastern port of Salamis, where the marketplace has been excavated and the theater restored, they preached in the synagogues here, which would be the pattern throughout Paul's mission travels, to the Jew first and then the Greek. Traveling from Salamis across the Copper Island via the South Shore Road, they would have seen vistas like this along the southwestern coast of Cyprus before reaching Paphos on the west coast, the provincial capital of the island. Paphos boasted this important harbor, which was busy even in St. Paul's day. At that time, Cyprus was one of Rome's senatorial provinces, and it was governed by a proconsul named Sergius Paulus. The governor himself met the three missionaries and inquired about their mission. Saul seems to have taken the initiative in responding, giving so eloquent a statement that the governor was much impressed. But Sergius Paulus, like so many heads of state, also had opportunists and leeches at his headquarters. And one of them was a weird practitioner of the occult named Elymas, who happened to be a Jew. There were many sorcerers, exorcists, and magicians in the ancient world, and surviving stone faces show that the ancients loved to scare themselves almost as much as moderns do. Now, this Elymas was worried that his influence over the governor would slip if he converted to Christianity, so he interrupted Saul to oppose him.
"You son of the devil,"
snapped Saul in some of the strongest language he ever used.
"Will you not stop making crooked the straight paths of the Lord?"
What particularly bothered the apostle was not only this nasty interruption of what could have been his first Gentile conversion, but also the fact that Elymas was a renegade Jew who should not have been dabbling in magic. And so he continued,
"Now listen, the hand of the Lord is against you, and you will be blind for a while, unable to see the sun."
Struck with blindness, Elymas had to be led away. It was the first recorded wonder from the hand of Saul, and it impressed Sergius Paulus so strongly that he believed the apostolic message and became a Christian, a strategic conversion. Some have questioned whether or not the Roman governor of Cyprus actually became a convert, but no one can dispute the man's existence. An ancient inscription was discovered at Rome indicating that Lucius Sergius Paulus was also a curator of the banks and beds of the Tiber, a river and flood control commissioner back in Italy. In reporting this episode, the record in Acts makes a crucial shift in naming Saul. Saul, also known as Paul. And from Acts 13, verse 9 on, he will be called Paul throughout the rest of the book of Acts and in all of his epistles. Some, such as the early church father Origen, have suggested that Saul renamed himself in honor of his first distinguished convert, Sergius Paulus. But this seems merely coincidental. More likely, Saul chose a similar sounding name by which he wanted to be known in the future in view of his ministry to the Gentile world. With their mission in Cyprus accomplished for the present, Paul, Barnabas, and Mark took ship from Paphos and sailed northwestward to Perga in Pamphylia on the coast of Asia Minor. Pamphylia is a beautiful area located between the Taurus Mountains and the Mediterranean. It flows with many small rivers that drain into a variety of picturesque harbors in what is today called the Turkish Riviera. Just as at Tarsus, sometimes these rivers break into a series of cataracts, like the beautiful Kurşunlu Falls, which are close to the itinerary the three missionaries would have taken when they reached Perga. The chief city in Pamphylia, Perga remains, even in ruins, a majestic sight, which includes a theater, a great hippodrome that seated 14,000 people, and handsome streets lined with columns. When Paul, Barnabas, and Mark passed through these massive stone gates at Perga, the gates were already 300 years old. Inside the gates, the area is littered with fascinating remains of this once proud city, including stones with inscriptions such as this one, dedicated to the Roman Emperor Augustus. The main street at Perga is 21 meters wide and lined with a colonnade very impressive even in ruins. Stately columns with Ionic capitals delight the modern eye even as they did the ancient. A water channel ran down the center of the street in a series of small waterfalls, all supplied from this great fountain at the northern end, presided over by the local river god. But it was at Perga that Paul, Barnabas, and John Mark suffered some sort of personality crisis. John Mark abandoned the other two and returned by ship to Antioch. Now, why he did this is not explained in the New Testament. Some scholars have suggested that the young fellow was unable to take the rigors of missionary travel, and therefore he decided he'd better go back to safety. Others, however, suggest another reason, and I think it may have something to do with the leadership of the apostles. Now, when they started out, Barnabas was clearly in charge of the expedition because he's mentioned first. The Spirit said, "Set apart for me Barnabas and Saul for the work to which I've called them." But you notice in Cyprus, the order is reversed. Henceforth, it's going to be Paul and Barnabas, not Barnabas and Saul. And the priority is always given to the first person in a row of names. And I think John Mark may have resented Paul's assuming the leadership from his cousin, who, after all, had been around right from the start. And perhaps that's the reason. In any case, all this does is demonstrate that apostles are human beings after all. Paul and Barnabas did not stay long in Perga at this time, but when they returned at the close of their first mission journey, they did remain long enough at this important city to preach and converse with the people here. Now they set out for the city of Antioch in Pisidia, not to be confused with the other Antioch in Syria. They took the Via Sebaste, one of the Roman roads Augustus had commissioned. How did Paul and Barnabas travel? Most probably on foot. Had they been military officers or Roman governmental officials, horses would have been available for them at regular relay stations. But wasn't it dangerous for two people to travel alone in those days? Before Rome brought peace and prosperity to the Mediterranean world, it would have been very dangerous. But the great Pax Augusta, the well-named Peace of Augustus, brought a good measure of security by land and sea to Rome's provinces, and major highways like this road to Antioch were patrolled. But in the hinterlands, this wasn't always the case, as Paul himself tells us in 2 Corinthians 11, where he writes that he was on frequent journeys in danger from rivers, danger from bandits, danger in the city, danger in the wilderness, danger at sea, often in watchings, hungry and thirsty, often without food and cold. Whenever they could, Paul and Barnabas probably joined a small caravan of fellow travelers which would better defend them against outlaws. At night, the group might sleep around campfires to keep themselves warm, and even Paul would have to take his turn on watch. On other occasions, Paul and Barnabas would probably sleep in tents that he himself had made in view of his profession. It was a 100-mile journey from Perga to Antioch in Pisidia. Their road led ever upward across the formidable Taurus mountain range and its spectacular scenery, with rugged cliffs plunging into river valleys below. Once over the Taurus, Paul and Barnabas found themselves on tablelands at an almost 4,000-foot altitude. There is no question but that they must have stopped by the shores of what is today called Lake Agadir to enjoy its beauty, and perhaps even take a swim. The ever-changing colors in this panorama would surely have prompted them to praise the beauty of God's creation. On foot, the pair would have been able to cover about 15 miles a day, and so reach Antioch in about a week. Antioch in Pisidia has a very handsome setting in the hills of southwestern Asia Minor. Fortunately, the modern Turkish town of Yalvaç is situated adjacent to the ruins of the ancient city, not over them. Recent excavations have uncovered a remarkable series of paved streets, impressive gateways, and open squares. This is the Cardo, the main north-south thoroughfare which led from the city gate southward and upward toward the center of Antioch. As at Perga, a watercourse runs under the street, and there is no question but that Paul and Barnabas walked over these very paving stones after they arrived in Antioch to begin a major mission effort. Looming over the Pisidian countryside, and at the very highest point of the city, remains of a temple dedicated to the Roman Emperor Augustus have come to light, the only one ever discovered with a circular apse. Again, Augustus was the emperor in charge when both Jesus and Paul were born. The plain Doric columns of the temple stand in decided contrast to the busy bull motifs festooning other parts of the temple, pagan trappings that the missionary pair soon denounced. Antioch was a very cosmopolitan community. It was in the southern part of the area called Galatia in ancient times, so named from Gauls who invaded Asia Minor in the 3rd century BC. Native Galatians formed the core of the population, but there were also Phrygians, Greeks, Jews, and especially also Romans, who settled a large colony of army veterans here at Antioch and constructed this aqueduct to bring water into the city. Of all these ethnic groups, however, Paul and Barnabas would first bring the good news to their own kind. That was a standard Pauline practice from this point on. On the day of the Sabbath, they went into the synagogue at Pisidian Antioch, this synagogue, in fact, which has recently been excavated, and they sat down. After the usual reading from the law and the prophets, the ruler of the synagogue stood up and very generously addressed them and said, "Brothers, if you have any words of encouragement, give them." Paul would later deliver his first recorded sermon here, where the later Church of St. Paul would be erected at Antioch, now in ruins, the southern wall of which was part of the synagogue. Paul now stood up, and ever so effectively he showed how scriptural prophecy pointed directly to Jesus, the Messiah who had been prosecuted by Jerusalem authorities.
Because they did not recognize him or understand the words of the prophets that are read every Sabbath, they fulfilled those words by condemning him.
But rejection and death were followed by resurrection and new life for Jesus, as well as for all believers. Paul's message raised a sensation, and he was invited to return to the synagogue a week later. On the next Sabbath, almost the whole city came out to hear him, according to the record in the book of Acts. But included in that throng were some very Orthodox Jews who disputed Paul's claims. After heated debate, Paul warned them,
"It was necessary that the word of God should be spoken first to you. But since you reject it, and judge yourselves unworthy of eternal life, we are now turning to the Gentiles.
This would be standard operating procedure for Paul from now on, each time he was confronted by Jewish rejection of the Christian message. The Gentile mission field at Antioch was a broad, crazy quilt of different ethnic groups, especially including a strong colony of Roman military veterans. As a matter of fact, one reason that Paul and Barnabas may have aimed for Antioch and Pisidia was on the recommendation of Sergius Paulus, the governor of Cyprus, because archaeological evidence shows that this family of the Sergii Paulii had strong roots in Pisidian Antioch, and as charity begins at home, perhaps also mission work. In any case, Paul's message was warmly received by the Gentiles, and a strong Christian congregation was founded at Antioch, which thrived. It was full of joy in the Holy Spirit, according to the book of Acts. Unfortunately, however, increasing pressure from the synagogue finally led to outright expulsion of the two missionaries, and they now left Antioch and headed about 100 miles east-southeast to Iconium, most likely using this Roman bridge that still spans one of the valleys on the road to Iconium. Unlike Antioch, which remains in ruins, Iconium today is a huge Turkish metropolis called Konya, and the very size of the city has hopelessly buried the ancient Iconium, including all sites associated with St. Paul. Konya is now better known for the mosque and museum associated with the 13th century poet Mevlana Rumi, who founded the mystic order of the whirling dervishes. This part of the ancient wall of Iconium is all that remains of the city visited by our missionaries. 19 centuries ago, however, Paul and Barnabas used the same mission strategy at Iconium as at Antioch, preaching first in the Jewish synagogue. Their success here was again challenged by an Orthodox Jewish reaction, which divided the audience and pressured the apostles to move on. But before they left, they founded the second church in Asia Minor, and it would thrive. Their next destination, Lystra, lay some 25 miles southwest of Iconium. Like Antioch, it was a Roman colony and boasted a population that included Roman army veterans ever since Augustus first planted them there to guard against Taurus mountain bandits. Lystra, near Hatun Saray in modern Turkey, has not yet been excavated, so it is nothing more than a huge mound in a country district of southern Galatia known in ancient times as Lycaonia. How do we know that this was once a city? The answer lies at the summit of this mound. Although Lystra has never been excavated, some amateur dug a preliminary survey pit here. And how do we know indeed there ever was a buried city here? For instance, if we saw a stone like this could be natural. But notice when we turn the stone over, there is a flat, polished side to it. Aha! That makes this an artifact, something that Mother Nature did not put here, but humankind did. Or when we get the edge of an amphora or a jar, showing the ceramic, indicating again human workmanship. Or the round top of a jar. All these items found either at the surface or in little pits like this. Another ceramic jar edge, showing indeed that these were, at the time from St. Paul, the very things that were crafted by the people of Lystra. Somewhere underneath this mound in the past, however, an extraordinary drama unfolded when Paul and Barnabas arrived in town. Although Paul rarely used signs and wonders to authenticate his message, he made an exception here when he saw that one of his listeners was a cripple who had never walked in his life.
"Stand up on your feet,"
Paul told the cripple, and the book of Acts reports that the man actually sprang up and began to walk. The crowd was thunderstruck. Abandoning the Greek in which they had been conversing with Paul, they switched to their native Lycaonian dialect. And they said, "The gods have come down to us in human form." And such gods. Barnabas they called Zeus, the father of gods and men. And Paul they called Hermes, the god of communication. This has always been an interesting clue as to the physical appearance of these two missionaries. Barnabas was obviously the larger of the two, as Zeus would be. And Hermes would be quicker and agile and perhaps a little smaller. Now, it's true that the name Paulos in Greek and Latin means small or gentle, but it was also the name of some famous families in Rome who were anything but small and gentle. We have a better idea as to what Paul looked like from the walls of the Roman catacombs, into which he's pictured as a smaller figure with a pointy gray beard.
But back to Lystra.
The bedazzled priest of Zeus was so sure that the father of the gods himself had come into town that he was processing up to the gates of the city with oxen and garlands to do public sacrifice. Now you may say, how naive can these Lystrans be? And yet this was the setting of the famous Greek myth of Bacchus and Philemon. They were an aged couple who once entertained Zeus and Hermes as they came into town in human form. And the townspeople who ignored them were turned into frogs, whereas the home of Bacchus and Philemon became a beautiful temple adorned with gold and marble. Would lightning strike twice, the Lystrans wondered.
Paul quickly set them straight.
"Why are you doing this?"
He cried.
"We're mortals, just like you, and we bring you good news, that you should turn from these worthless things to the living God,"
whom he went on to describe. Sadly, adversaries arrived from Antioch and Iconium who had made a special trip to Lystra to denounce the apostles. A drastic change of mood swept the crowd. The gods were now impostors who had to be punished. Paul was attacked by a shrieking mob and stoned. He was dead before his supporters could save him.
Or so the Lystrans thought. Actually, Paul was probably knocked unconscious by one of the stones and presumed dead. But when Barnabas and the new Christians gathered around him, he regained his senses and stood on his feet. I doubt if any thoughts of self-pity were swirling in his mind, because he would have been the first to remember a man named Stephen and how he here was receiving a little taste of his own medicine. This is the stoning that Paul had in mind in 2 Corinthians 11 when he's detailing the difficulties he endured. And he said, "Once I was stoned."
Paul and Barnabas soon left for Derbe, the last town in their itinerary, about 55 miles southeast of Lystra. Here, happily, they preached without incident and made many disciples, the first place in Galatia where they had not encountered opposition. Today, Derbe is just a mound that stands in a lonely plain. As with Lystra, there have been no archaeological excavations as yet at Derbe. At the summit of this buried city, wind and rain have exposed bits of stone and pottery, which are all that remain of this last Galatian outpost before its boundaries with Cilicia, Paul's own province. From Derbe, it would have been easiest for Paul and Barnabas simply to continue eastward through the Taurus mountain pass and home to Antioch. But what was easiest was not always best for the gospel. Since it was important to check on the progress of their new missions, Paul and Barnabas went 3 times as far homeward in the opposite direction, bracing up the new believers in Lystra, Iconium, and Antioch, and appointing elders to guide them. This wise strategy led to permanent Christian churches in all these cities.
Then they retraced their steps southward to the Mediterranean coast, where Paul preached for some time at Perga, which we've already seen, after which they set sail from Atalia. Today, the port is called Antalya, one of the most beautiful Turkish harbors in the entire Riviera area. It is perched on sheer cliffs that plunge down to the blue and turquoise Mediterranean Sea. From here, the 2 missionaries embarked on a ship bound for Syria.
which made for an easy voyage straight eastward, wafted forward by reliable westerly and northwesterly winds to their rear. Soon they were at the mouth of the Orontes River.
When Paul and Barnabas returned to Selucia and Antioch, they could deliver a very colorful mission report indeed to the church which had commissioned them, because God had opened a door of faith to the Gentiles, indeed, a door that would never close in the future. The first great mission journey had come to its close.